What a beautiful day the Lord has blessed us with to enjoy. And I can't think of a better way to end the evening than coming together and worshiping Him in, in spirit and in truth. And I pray that what I say will be pleasing in His sight. This morning we began looking at Zacchaeus and how Zacchaeus sought out Jesus. Zacchaeus had several factors that would have prevented him or could have prevented him from seeking out Jesus, and it prevents many today from finding him as well. The first was that Zacchaeus had riches. He was a wealthy tax collector, and Jesus says it's difficult for a rich man to get into heaven. Because, as Paul warns of, we start trusting and looking in to our riches for our security. And there's no sin in being rich if we've obtained the money through hard work and honesty. We could do a lot of good with it. There's nothing that says we should hate those who are rich. We could do much good with wealth and helping others. But when we allow it to interfere and come between us and the Lord, that is when it becomes sinful. Also, he had a position of authority. He was the chief tax collector, not just a tax collector, the chief tax collector. Paul was important as well. He had a lot of pedigree behind his name as to who he was. And that's why we start trusting in that, just like our riches. And that's why we're warned that there's not many mighty or noble or big on this earth by earthly standards that answer the gospel call, because we don't want to give up that position of authority. Also, when we look at Zacchaeus, he had a physical issue getting to Jesus, and that was the crowd. In Luke chapter 19 and in verse 3, he sought to see Jesus but could not because of the crowd. He couldn't get to him because of the throngs of people that were trying to get to Zacchaeus. And he was short and he could not see Jesus over all of these people. I'm sure we've all been to an event, and it's frustrating when we get to an event and there's somebody that feels like they're 12 feet tall in front of us and we can't see what's happening. That's very annoying to do that. And Zacchaeus was trying to see Jesus. He couldn't for the crowd, but he was determined. He overcame this problem by running ahead of the crowd and climbing up into this tree so that he could see Jesus. He didn't care what others thought about him, did he? A grown man climbing a tree, I don't think it would have been that much different back then as it would today. If we saw that, we would probably make fun of that person, wouldn't we? If we were at a parade or something like that, and here's this grown man climbing up in a tree to see the parade better, we would assume that he had some kind of mental defect or lacking therein, because that's not something that a normal person would do. It would attract attention, wouldn't it? We'd be pulling out our phones, trying to get our viral video and post that online as fast as we could, making fun of this person. And I would doubt that it was different back then. Here comes this man climbing up in a tree. Probably a little awkward feeling for him to be doing that. But the crowd was holding him back, and he was not going to let that happen. We can let crowds affect us as well today, even as back in the Old Testament times here. Following that crowd in Exodus chapter 23 and verse 2. We follow that crowd out of fear of being laughed at. We don't want to be alone or be thought of as different. So we compromise what we believe in. We compromise those beliefs to go along with them, even if we don't fully agree with them. Exodus chapter 23 and verse 2. You shall not follow a crowd to do evil, nor shall you testify in a dispute so as to turn aside after many to pervert justice. Oh, how we see so much of that in our world today. And it's frustrating when we see that. We can't follow the majority just to fit in with the majority. That doesn't make it right. Large numbers, as we saw last weekend or 2 weekends ago in Cincinnati, that they've now got national attention over, large numbers doing something does not mean that it's something good. If those large numbers are going to do something evil, God still won't approve. Don't follow the crowd to do evil. One thing is for sure, if we're living the Christian life as Jesus told us, that the way to heaven is straight and narrow and difficult. There's going to be few that find that. The Christian will not be in the majority. The Christian will not fit in with the rest of the world. Romans chapter 12 and verse 1. And we look at this passage as frequently as we do 2 Timothy chapter 3 about the scriptures. But in Romans chapter 12 and beginning in verse 1, I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. We're transformed, not conformed. Romans 12 is referred to as the synopsis of the Christian life. It tells us how we are to live in many different ways. And it begins with telling us that we're not like the rest of the world. We're not going to fit in. We're not going to fit into the mold, the ever-changing mold and ever-declining morality that the world has. If we're going to get along with the crowd, then it's pretty safe to say that we're not going to be pleasing to God. And I think sometimes we act like that only the young people have issues with peer pressure. Someone said, if you want to know the adult version of peer pressure, wait until your neighbor cuts their grass. And then we have to cut ours because that makes us look like we're lazy. Some people don't care. But adults have peer pressure too. I doubt that if I ask for a show of hands, even with as few as we have here, do you want to be alone and stand out to a crowd? I would say that most, in a negative way, I would say that most of us don't want to stand out at all, but we definitely don't want to stand out in a negative way. Maybe if we're being honored, some people might like that, to be singled out, but I don't think most of us would want to stand out in a crowd. Here's Zacchaeus, this grown man climbing up a tree. He was probably standing out a little bit, wasn't he? He didn't let the crowd, literally or figuratively, keep him away from Jesus. And neither should we. We can't follow the crowd just because it's the majority. We have to find out where Christ is. Also, Zacchaeus had a past, as everyone does. We all have a past. And in some cases, that can interfere with us finding Jesus. Zacchaeus talked about that in Luke chapter 19 and verse 18. He talked about if he had wrongfully taken anything from anyone by false accusation, I restore fourfold. Now, we talked earlier in the beginning about this position that he had and how it offered him the opportunity to take more than he was entitled to. The Roman government didn't care. As long as they got their cut, the publicans could take whatever tax over and above that they could get out of the people. And he was in a position of authority. And some of those in similar positions were evil, hated people because of that. They took whatever they want, and then they just got to keep the rest because of the corruption, and that position was so rampant. That Zacchaeus is saying here, if I have done anything wrongfully, I will return it. Not only will I return it, I will return 4 times what I took in restitution. This is a sign of a pure and a changed heart, that he wanted to do what was right. He already said that he had given half of his goods to the poor to help them. But if I've wronged someone, then I'm going to restore it as well. But doesn't that show a sign of sorrow and penance just for the possibility of his past mistakes? If he's done wrong, I want to make it right. And that should be our attitude. Many won't find Jesus or don't find him because of their sinful past. Either they're holding on to it and wanting to continue in it, or they can't let go of what they have done in their previous life. It doesn't matter to Jesus what we have been. He only cares about what we will become. He's there for the finding. It's up to us. And this world is difficult. It places a lot of pressure on us. Sinful temptations abound. There's none of us that was perfect. There's not one of us that, when we obeyed the gospel, had no sin. Because if that's the case, then why would we have obeyed the gospel? We should have obeyed the gospel when we realized that we were sinners, that we were in sin, and that we needed Christ. There's no saint without a past. And there's no sinner that doesn't have the hope of a future. We can't hold on to that past, though. And we can't continue in it. But many like to look back at their previous life. Paul talks about always looking forward. In Philippians chapter 3 and verse 13 and 14, he was looking towards that higher goal, that upward calling. Philippians chapter 3 and beginning in verse 13. Brethren, I do not count myself to have apprehended, but one thing I do, forgetting those things which are behind and reaching forward to those things which are ahead. I press toward the goal for the prize of the upward call of God in Christ Jesus. If we're running in a race, and I've never run in a marathon and probably never will, because there's nothing big enough chasing me to motivate me to run in a race like that. But I've heard that if you're running in a race, most people don't look behind them to see what's coming. They look forward at what's ahead. They look for the finish line. A football player looks beyond the line of defense that's in front of him, and he looks towards the goal line and how we can get from around these people that are strategically placed on the field to my goal, which could be many yards away. If we're in a race, are we worried about who's behind us, or are we looking forward at what's in front of us? That's what Paul is doing. I'm looking ahead. I'm putting those things behind, all those things that we talked about this morning, the education, the status, the ancestry. I was from the stock, the tribe of Benjamin. I was a Hebrew of Hebrews. I've put all that behind me because that's going to hinder me from reaching my goal and going forward. Not only did Paul have a past of those things, Paul had a past of sin. He had a terrible past. That is something that I believe if we look at his writings, we can see bothered him because of what he did throughout the rest of his life, but he still kept going forward. He didn't say, I'm so bad that I can't fix this. He said, we're going to work forward. In 1 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 12 beginning. 1 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 12. Look at all that he has done here. We're going to skip over Acts chapter 26, but 1 Timothy chapter 1 and beginning in verse 12. And I thank Jesus Christ our Lord, who has enabled me, because he counted me faithful, putting me into the ministry, although I was formerly a blasphemer, a persecutor, and an insolent man, but I obtained mercy because I did it ignorantly in unbelief. And the grace of our Lord was exceedingly abundant with faith and love which are in Christ Jesus. There is a faithful saying, this is a faithful saying and worthy of all acceptance, that Jesus Christ came into the world to save sinners, of whom I am chief. I did all these things. I cast my vote for these Christians to be put to death, that I had hauled off and committed them to prison. I'm the worst of the worst, but I obtained mercy. But he did that. He was able to obtain mercy because of his willingness to change. Paul did not let his past hold him back. Could Paul have become the Apostle Paul if he continued in the lifestyle that he was living, where he was going out and rounding up Christians with the arrest warrants to do so from the Sanhedrin council and from the Pharisees and the leaders of the Jewish nation, if he was still doing that? Could he have continued living like that, doing that, and still been a Christian? That would have been kind of hard, wouldn't it? He put that behind him. And he said, I obtained mercy because he was willing to obey the gospel's call. Zacchaeus had a past as well, but he put that behind him. He had many different challenges. We all have challenges. Zacchaeus, if we look at him and comparing him with the rich young ruler, when Jesus talked to him, keep this command and all these I've done since my youth. Well, if we look at Zacchaeus, we'd say, oh, he's one that we could easily convert to the cause of Christ. If we look at Zacchaeus, we may say that he had every reason to give up and to quit. But he found his way against those odds and those obstacles because he sought Jesus and found him. Many would say, when we look at Zacchaeus, nope, that's too much. I'm wealthy. I'll have to give up my position of authority. I may have to change this or that. No, it's too much. The crowd's too heavy. I'm too short. It's just too hard. And we see a lot of people like that. It's just too hard to make this change. Nobody said it was going to be easy, but Jesus is worth it, isn't he? Many quit seeking Jesus because of struggles with family or finances, sin, failure, fatigue, maybe problems in the church. It can get discouraging sometimes. The list could go on and on. But James chapter 1, verses 2 through 4 reminds us that God's blessings are greater than any of the challenges that we face. In James chapter 1 and in verse 2, my brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. But let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. We all have I'm not going to say we. I have a problem with patience. It's something that I struggle with, that I try to work on and grow. And James, and some days I do okay, but some days I fail. James is reminding us that faith and patience are the foundation of our spiritual growth. When those are in place and these difficult trials come upon us, then not only are we going to get through them, but we're going to strengthen those virtues because they have been put to the test and they have overcome. And I know some days my patience level is not as strong as it should be, especially when I'm driving, but that's another story. But as a Christian, that's something that we always need to be working on and continually adding patience to our faith. 2 Peter chapter 1 and beginning in verse 5, in bearing all these trials and difficulties that he's talking to these people here about, the problems that was going to be coming upon them and that they were going to be enduring. Have that perseverance, because as your faith is tried, it's going to come out stronger on the other side. Beginning in verse 5 here, 2 Peter chapter 1, but also for this reason, giving all diligence, add to your faith virtue, to virtue knowledge, to knowledge self-control, to self-control perseverance, to perseverance godliness, to godliness brotherly kindness, and to brotherly kindness love. Now these are not qualities that we work on one at a time and say, well, I have knowledge conquered. Now I'm going to go on to self-control. I have self-control conquered. I'm going to go on to perseverance. That's not what Peter's saying, but we build on these blocks and we grow those each day. That's easier said than done, isn't it? Especially that patience one. But sometimes self-control goes right along with that, doesn't it? And perseverance. Sometimes that's hard. The challenges, the perseverance that Zacchaeus showed. Well, I can't get to Jesus the way that it is right now. So I'm going to run ahead And then I'm going to get up in that tree so I can get over that crowd. That's sometimes when we want to throw in the towel and say we're done. Every project that we did inside this auditorium, I can tell you what, we hit one roadblock after the other. There were times that I was ready to throw my tools through something, but I didn't. I've done that before, but this time I didn't. That perseverance, that self-control, building that, strengthening that, so that when we face those challenges, we don't always fall behind and get taken back. And unlike the rich young ruler, when Zacchaeus found Jesus and Jesus came to him and told him to come down out of that tree, Zacchaeus responded immediately in Luke chapter 9 and in verse 6. So he made haste and came down and received him joyfully. Jesus saw him in that tree. Here's this man that has climbed up this tree to get a better view and hopefully have some contact with the Lord, and he went over to him. Well, we've seen, I'm sure, maybe a celebrity or an athlete when there are throngs of fans waiting to see them, and they'll wait for hours in whatever element just to get a glimpse of their favorite celebrity. And they get so excited when they come over and recognize them, or maybe come over and sign a piece of memorabilia that they have. Because this person that they've waited so long to see is there. Jesus went over to Zacchaeus. Who should we be more excited to see than Jesus? Jesus went to Zacchaeus and said, come down out of that tree. He came down joyfully to Christ. He didn't look around at all the potential obstacles in the way. Others did. What did they say? Well, they were, what's he doing going to the house of this publican? Why is he associating with him? Well, he has this wealth and power and all these other things, this influence. Well, why is the Lord associating with him? Unlike the rich young ruler who went away sorrowfully from Jesus, Zacchaeus came in haste to him immediately. And because of that, he was able to take hold of salvation. In Luke chapter 19 and verse 9 and 10, Jesus said to him, today salvation has come to this house, because he also is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save that which was lost. He was lost. We all are lost if we haven't obeyed the gospel. Zacchaeus would not have had an opportunity to be saved at that point in time, would he have? Because the law of Christ hadn't went into effect yet. Salvation was there with him. He triumphed over all of the potential obstacles that we looked at in his life. We have many of the similar obstacles. We're all wealthy compared to most, especially in parts of the other parts of the world. I heard one person say that if you make over $30,000, you're in the 1% around the world. Now, I find that hard to believe, but there are some very poor places in this world. $30,000 is, I don't even think, above the poverty level in this country. So yes, we're wealthy, we're blessed materially compared to others. But we have positions of authority. We have problems with crowds and following the majority. All of these things that can hinder us, that could have hindered Zacchaeus, but he didn't let them. He came down to the Lord and he answered that call. And we have the same opportunity to do the same in our lives. If you're subject to the Lord's invitation in any way, we take this time to think about the condition of our soul. And if we need to make changes, we do that now. If anything, every day should remind us when we get up in the morning and turn on the TV, if we do that first thing, or open, well, I don't know, not too many people open a printed paper, but if we do that, Dad does, if we open the printed paper, we can see that, well, it's 3 days old by the time it makes it to the printed paper, but we can see somebody's plans changed. I went on a shoot this past week and knew that the fellow that I was meeting, that his father had had some health issues, and I said, hey, how's your dad doing? He said, he passed away last night. I felt about that tall because here he was doing something that I had asked him to do. I said, why didn't you cancel? Well, I needed the distraction. But that was unexpected. And we hear about that all the time, that we had plans, but something changed. So if there's something that we need to correct in our lives, let's do so now while we have the opportunity as we stand and sing.
There's a